Hello everybody and welcome back. I am your host, Sonat the Hero Type, and this is chapter 4 of How to RP1. We're finally there, we're finally going Orbital. Unfortunately, this does come with some bad news, I'm afraid. Unfortunately, due to certain life situations, this is probably going to be the last video I ever upload to YouTube, at least for a while. I'm officially calling it quits, I guess. And this has nothing to do with my viewers. You guys have been super awesome, super supportive. I've enjoyed all of the communications I've had with all of you guys. It's just unfortunately, I just don't enjoy doing this anymore. I enjoy playing games, and it just feels like lately I don't get to play them anymore. Now I just spend all my time recording, and it's just... I need to step back and stop, because the last thing I want to do is make something that has given me so much enjoyment and so much stress relief and turn it into a job and make it super stressful. But now that I got that announcement out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the actual video. The reason you're here, how to get Orbital in RP1 for the first time. Now, before we get into the actual building part of this, we're going to talk about the tech you need to make sure you have unlocked before we get into the VAB section. And of course, it's going to start off with having Orbital Rocketry unlocked, which is going to be this tab right over here. Now, we unlocked this in the last episode, and you could technically do this without having this unlocked, but this is going to make your life a lot easier. And again, this is aimed for newer players. The next thing I highly recommending is having early avionics and probes finalized. You don't need it, but the weight reduction and mass reduction is going to make the rocket a lot less clunky. It will allow you to overbuild it a bit and make it more versatile, so you can reuse this launch vehicle for the first beginning contracts. Now, satellite era science isn't something you need to unlock for your first launch, but if you look down here, it has that Geiger counter and a few other experiments which are nice to have, but you'll need the Geiger molar counter to do the first scientific satellite, so you want to make sure you get that research as soon as possible. If you already have it unlocked and you haven't gotten Orbital yet, you can actually combine the two contracts, but we're going to talk about that a little bit more once we get over to mission control. Other than that, everything else you'll need has already been unlocked, because the prerequisites for orbital rocketry is literally everything else I'm going to recommend outside of that avionics one I talked about. Let's hop over to mission control, talk about a few things, and then build the very first orbital rocket. So you have two main contracts, first artificial and first scientific satellite. Now we're going to focus on artificial satellites because that's the launch we're going to be doing, since we don't have the tech for scientific unlock, but you could technically grab both of these if you're already researching the scientific stuff to get a bunch of extra funding. That way you can kind of speed things along. That's kind of up to you, but once you grab the first artificial contract, you'll actually unlock a couple of other satellite contracts, which I'm going to show you here in a second. So once you accept the first artificial satellite contract, you'll be able to access these other contracts I'm talking about, but I wouldn't grab any of them right away, because typically the scientific satellite's going to give you more bang for your buck, and you can use all that advanced funding to really upgrade your KSC and get things moving. And if done right, the rocket we're going to build for the first artificial satellite is going to be able to do the scientific satellite. All you have to do is add an experiment, and the weight difference isn't going to change much. So you don't have to actually build or retool anything, so feel free to just spend all of that advanced funding. But make sure you can have a rocket that works before spending all of it, because again, these have deadlines, and if you don't complete them by the deadline, the amount of negative funding you get from failing the contracts will bankrupt your program, and it kind of ends the game. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and look at these other contracts real fast. I'm just going to go into the RPO menu over here and just scroll down to early satellite contracts, and you'll see there's two available, solar power and orbital. Now, solar power can't be done until we unlock solar panels, which is still being researched, but the polar satellite can be done. However, I'm going to recommend you wait to do that one until you unlock that science tab, because there's an early film camera experiment that is biome specific, and it gives you a lot of science when you do the polar launches, because it covers every biome eventually. But typically, I'm going to recommend you grab the artificial contract, and if you can't afford to build your rocket, grab the scientific one, but try to make sure you have, the scientific tab researching. That way you don't run into any deadline issues or, end up bankrupting your program. But with that, let's go ahead and get to building our very first orbital rocket. Now, before we dive in completely, I just want to say there are multiple ways to build this. I'm just giving you guys an easy option, something that I typically use most of the time, because it gives you a lot of wiggle room to play with, and it's really good for beginners. That being said, let's go ahead and hop into the very first part, selecting our probe core. Now for this example, I'm just going to use the Sputnik core because I'm being lazy. If you want to make a procedural science core, you can, but this will be an uncontrolled rocket. The very top stage will be uncontrolled at least, and we're going to use some spin stability. So we're going to add a decoupler on top of it, so once we get into orbit, we can separate the rockets, and this will be able to fly around in orbit until it runs out of power, or you blow it up. Either way is up to you. Now we're going to stick with conventional tanks. You do unlock the balloon tanks and integral tanks, but they're very expensive and you don't quite need them. And the price of building your first orbital rocket's usually pretty expensive either way you look at it, so we're going to stick with what we already have unlocked to save some money. Now we're going to want to make this a very specific size. This will be a Space Bee using an AJ-10 variant of the Aero Bee, and the size I'm going to recommend you aim for is 0.4 by 3.5. That will give you the full 52 seconds of burn time. You could stretch it to 4 if you want, but you're kind of overburning the engine a lot more than you should, and there's a point where just adding more fuel doesn't actually help anybody. Now this particular stage is going to be pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and once we get all this put together is when a lot of the more technical stuff is going to happen. We're going to spin this rocket, but we're going to be using the stage below it to actually set up the spin. So once you get this set up how you want it, again, I'm going with the 0.4 by 3.5. We're pretty much wrapped up with this. You can go ahead and add experiments to this if you want, change the way it looks. That's totally up to you. I'll be honest, I don't really focus on aesthetics for this rocket because I'm just kind of giving you guys a general idea. Feel free to design it how you want and make changes and, do the color stuff and however you feel like it. But now that we have this done, we need to add another decoupler. This will be a final stage for us, and you want to make sure the decoupler and the engine are staged at the same time. It will make a little bit of sense once we actually get to the flight part of this, because we're going to be using the bottom stage, some RCS to spin and ullage it, and you want to ignite the engine as you decouple it so it kicks away from the second stage. Now it's time to talk about controlling the second stage and the top stage. Now we're going to make this probe core be able to control the second stage and still have the weight for the upper stage. That way we're in full control the entire time. And then after we do our second stage, we're going to build another avionics core to control the base of the rocket. Now you want to make this into some kind of cone shape to where the base of it will fit onto your second stage and the top of it will seamlessly end up into your upper stage. That way you get more of an aerodynamic profile, as well as it doesn't look super clunky. So we're going to make the top the 0.4, but we're going to make the base of it 1.25, mostly because it's going to reduce tooling costs since we've already tooled things at that diameter. We're also for the first time going to use the RO tanks, which they're exactly the same thing as the procedural tanks, but you can add different cores and different mounts to them, which that's the whole reason we're doing it. You can use the mount tab to kind of adjust the way the bottom of the tank looks, as well as makes the inner stage section of this a little bit easier to design since you don't have to try to line anything up with a flat tank. You can use the little bit of a curve I'm using here to kind of give the gap you need to make everything look a little bit better and kind of more seamless. Now once you get the mount selected and get everything else how you want it, we're going to go ahead and fill this tank with the fuel required, and then we're going to go ahead and stretch it out until it's just a few seconds over traded burn time. Pushing it a little bit isn't going to be a huge deal, plus with the residual stuff with the new update, it normally balances out, and just I'd recommend having a little more fuel than needed. Once you get the second stage of how you want it, we're going to need to go ahead and update the avionics just to make sure it can control everything. Now you don't need a whole lot of electric charge. In fact, I use more than you technically need. I think I get like 6 hours overall, but no, honestly, you're going to be dumping the stage before you even hit the 30-minute mark, so it doesn't really need to be that much. Another thing to keep in mind is you want to give the control amount a little bit more than needed, because we still need to add RCS and the fuel for it. That way we can use it to spin the rocket and control it once our second stage is done burning. And typically I'll go back and forth and make some small tweaks here and there depending on what I need exactly. You want to have the avionics as minimal as you can and the electric charge as low as you need. Now we need to add the RCS, which we're going to be just using the mid-sized RCS. The small ones do work, but they're not quite powerful enough, at least in my opinion. But you don't need the super big ones either. The main thing is you need to upgrade these to HTP. You do that the same way you'd upgrade an engine. You right click, go to engine, select HTP and spend the 10 grand. Compared to the other RCS types, it's definitely worth it. So just spend the 10 grand. It's going to make your life a lot easier. Now we're going to use a couple of radial tanks. In fact, we only need 2 of them, and they don't really need to be that big. But the reason I recommend using at least 2 of them, since we're spinning the craft, you're going to want to have the weight distribution even out on both sides. It's not a whole lot, but it can cause some wobble, but no bigger than 0.3. You need to make sure they're a high pressure tank because HTP requires high pressure. Once you change them to high pressure, it should give you the option to add HTTP to them. Sometimes it will glitch out and you just need to close the menu and reopen it like I'm doing here. Sometimes you gotta replace the RCS block, but eventually HTTP should pop back up, and then go ahead and add it and make sure you put all 4 of those back on there. And now we're pretty much done with the second stage. It should look something kind of like this. Again, feel free to design it how you want to, but I'm going to go ahead and do a quick freeze frame and show you 2 screenshots of the tank sizes just so you guys can see them a little clearer, so you know what you're kind of looking for. Now that we have all that taken care of, we need to make our inner stage. There's a couple different ones of these, but you want to make sure it's not a payload adapter and that it is in fact an interstage, which is going to be this guy right here. Now you're going to notice there's 2 different spots you can mount this on. Now the nice thing about the update is it actually gives you some green text and shows you which one decouples. You want to make sure your engine's attached to the one that says this node decouples. If not, it won't work properly. So once you get this attached correctly, you need to change the size to where the top of it will match up to whatever the tank size is on your second stage, which is 1.25, and then the bottom is going to be whatever your booster is going to be. Now I recommend bringing your height down to 0.1 or 0.2 because you don't need it to be that big. It's the extra height that's going to actually design your fairing, which I'm going to show you here in a second. Just keep that in mind. If you don't mess with that height, you'll have a lot of space in between, and it's not really needed. But when you adjust the extra height, you'll see the little blue lines change. You want to kind of line it up with the base of your upper stage. We're a little too high, so we're going to go ahead and bring that down a little bit. And we may have to make some adjustments to the RCS blocks as well, so they're not clipping in. It's not a huge deal, but it bugs the crap out of me. So we're going to shift these up just a little bit. And I'm going to speed through these next few seconds because this is me just being overly picky and tedious, and it's kind of boring to watch. So let me just get this out of the way, then we'll go ahead and finish designing the rest of our separation stage and get to the booster of the rocket. A little side note is you can use that density tab there on the actual fairing pieces and bring it all the way down to the left, and it will actually shave a bunch of weight off the rocket. It's kind of cheesy, but it is nice to know. Now onto the booster. We're going to make the bottom of the fairing piece 2.2 meters in diameter because that is going to be the size of tank we're going to be using. You can use 2 meters, 2.3, 2.4. 2.5 is a little excessive and kind of expensive, but 2.2 is a nice little middle ground. Like before, we're going to be using a modular or RO tank so we can use that mounting thing. We're going to make this 2.2. It's not going to be a high pressure tank, so we're just going to go to the most updated tank that's not high pressure and grab the LR79 engine, mount it to the bottom of the tank. We're going to add the fuel, and then we're going to stretch this tank out and give it a mount. Now, you want this to where you're using the booster for the brunt of the burn to get into orbit, but if you actually max out the full burn time, because this thing has a decently long burn time, you'll make it way too tall and skinny and end up making it way too much, and it's just not really worth it. Honestly, about 10 meters, maybe 11 is about as much as you want to go for this first rocket. We're going to stop at 8 to get the mount set up, add the avionics, and then adjust it from there. But in the end goal, you want your total delta V to be around 10,000. Now, you only need 9,400 meters a second of delta V to get into orbit, but we want to give us some extra wiggle room, as well as make sure we can hit higher orbits, as well as the polar orbit, which will take more delta V because it's going on a polar inclination. So we're going to open up the RP1 window, grab the procedural avionics like before, set it for 2.2 meters. We're going to slap that base tank back on, and then we're going to make some adjustments to where the avionics can be efficient for the total rocket. Now, you only need about 150 to 200 units of electric charge on this particular core, as this stage will be dumped about 2 minutes max into the flight. So we're just bring that down. I'm going to set it to about 200, and then we're going to go ahead and make the controllable mass enough to make the avionics sufficient for the whole rocket. Before we finalize anything, we're going to make some quick adjustments, and again, I'm going to make the base stage a little bit longer because I want to squeeze a little bit more delta V out of the overall rocket. I will be adding this craft file in the description if you just want to use this, but play around with this a little bit until you're happy with it, run several sims, and then once you have something you can be proud of, then go ahead, tool, buy, and build it. Now I'm going to go ahead and just go through and make sure all my stages are good to go and put it all back together, and then we'll get back to the next part. Now that we have everything mostly set up how we want it, we have the decent amount of Delta V, I do want to make this tank a little bit longer, and I'll have to obviously adjust the core a bit, but I want to squeeze as much Delta V as I can out of this. Again, we have 60 tons to use, and this rocket's going to clock in just under 50 tons total. A few quick tips. You notice that I have my engineer and my RP1 screen both up for pretty much the entire time I'm doing this. It's so I can make sure my Delta V is staying high enough, I can make sure my thrust to weight ratios are going to be good, and I can also make sure my avionics isn't getting screwed up from any changes I make. It's something you're always going to want to watch out for, because if you kind of ignore the avionics and you just add like a small thing and then you lose avionics control, it can cause all kinds of issues. Now, the other thing I wanted to put onto this is a separation motor, which is one of these little guys right here, and I'm actually going to mount them on top of the avionics core from the base stage. Since you will have to hot stage the AJ-10, this will cause the base core to kick back a little bit and prevent any type of colliding that may or may not happen. You don't always need these, but they're nice to have, and it's more of a safety deal. If you do decide to use them, make sure they're staged at the same time as stage separation and you're igniting your AJ-10 engine. That way it kicks back the booster as the separation is happening and the AJ is igniting. That way it gives a nice clean separation and nothing bad happens. Now I'm going to speed through this next part, but I'm just going to add a little bit of a stability wing setup on the bottom of this rocket. These aren't really needed, but they do help with roll control just a little bit, especially on these early rockets. There's not really any special way to design these, just give them kind of a small profile wing. You don't have to make sure the center of lift is above the center of mass or anything like that. The thrust ratio of the LR79 is going to overcome any possible instability issues. Again, it's not required, but they're nice to have for that roll control. But we're kind of getting to the end of this. Let's go ahead and slap on some launch clamps. And I'm going to put an umbilical cord on there just because I like to have these on my rockets. I don't actually think you need them. I've never built one without it, so don't quote me on that one. But once you get to this point, it's kind of just doing some checks and balances and making sure everything's set up how you want. So this is kind of the designing phase. If you want to make it look nicer, I'm going to kind of leave it as is. Now again, we did this in experimental mode, so we haven't bought anything yet. So you can't actually build this, which in a second here I'm going to show you what I mean by that, because we're going to click the launch button real fast and it's going to basically tell us that we need to unlock all of this stuff. Now, there's a really easy way to get around that, and basically you just have to make sure you have experimental mode turned on. I actually turned it off so I can buy those separator motors, but you turn experimental mode back on by clicking the little green icon, the little lab icon up at the top, and then it will allow you to purchase everything once you hit launch. Now, this is a lot of money. In fact, let's zoom into it so we can all cry about it together. So you're looking at 174,000 funds, and we haven't even had to tool this thing yet, which is why I told you you're going to need a bunch of funding to build the initial rocket. Now my game's going to crash here in just a second, and then we're going to fade back in real quick, and then we're going to go ahead and do a sim, and we're going to talk about the tooling costs, and the crash happens about now. Okay, and we're back. So real quick, I wanted to talk about changing your probe core before we went any deeper into this, because you can use anything you want for the probe core. The reason I use Sputnik though is because, one, I'm lazy, it's easy, it's cheap, but if you wanted to spend the money now, you can make some kind of procedural scientific core. That way you can add experiments to it, or you can make it a little more unique. You can even put a nose cone on top of it if you want, honestly. That's totally up to you. I typically like using a 6-sided hexagon when I'm making one of these, just because you can add solar panels to it easy later, you can mount experiments onto it easy later, and you can put experiments inside of it. But for the first artificial launch, I'm just going to use a Sputnik core, and I will be adding a little experiment on the top of it here in a second, but we're not gonna go too crazy and all out, because all the experiments we currently have unlocked, I already have all of the space low science for, except for the one we're gonna add, which is the ion mass spectrometer. I believe that's how you say it, and I'm gonna try and center it on here, and it's not gonna work out for me, but yeah. Let's just go ahead and add it, and then I'm gonna do some quick double checking on the rocket, and we're gonna hop over to a simulation so I can kind of show you guys how to fly this. I'm not gonna make you guys sit here and watch me try to center this, because it took me like, I don't know, a really long time. So let's go ahead and go over to a simulation, and I'll see you guys on the launch pad. And like magic, we're on the launch pad, and we're going to be using Smart Assist to go ahead and fly this rocket. I'm just going to make sure my experiments are all turned on. I'm going to drop down the MechJeb menu and open up the Smart ASS system, also known as MechJeb Smart Assist, or Smart Ass, depending on who you ask, really. But this is going to be a manually flied rocket. It just using the Smart Assist system makes life a little bit easier. Once you pull it up, you're going to want to click on the Surf tab, and then again on the Surf tab. Let's go ahead and zoom in so I can kind of explain to you how this this works. So you have three main things. You have HDG, which is heading. You have pitch, which is which way you're going to be turning. And then you have roll, which you can just leave at 0. That's not super important right now. But you want to leave your heading at 90 degrees because that means you're going to be making a normal gravity turn like you normally would when launching a rocket on the equator line. Now, the only time you really change heading is if you have to do a specific orbit, like a polar orbit or something along the lines of that. And then pitch, basically 90 degrees is straight up, 0 degrees is flying flat, which there are some depending factors and all that, but nothing that we need to really talk about now. Just keep those both at 90, and I'm going to explain to you how this all works. Now, with most early game engines, it takes a second to spool it up, so you want to stage it. You want to wait for your engine's plume to kick out fully, and then we're going to go ahead and launch. You want to pretty much fly straight upwards until you get to about 100 to 120 meters a second, and then slowly start pitching to the 90 degree mark. You do this by hitting the minus button next to pitch. So basically you're going to count down from 90 to eventually get to 0 or around there depending on how your gravity turn works out. And if for some reason you hit one of your clamps during the initial launch, just do minus and set it to 89 and it will basically keep you straight enough to get the gravity turn started. And you're just going to slowly start clicking that minus button. This will take some practice and there are different variations depending on what kind of orbit you're going for. But for a basic orbit, you just want to keep hitting that minus button and you want to be at about 45 by the time you get to 25 to 30 kilometers above the surface, but you want to try to stay in that prograde marker for as long as you can. Now, if you look at my nav ball, I am basically staying right on the front edge of it, which will push the prograde marker down with me and keep me in the most aerodynamic profile I can possibly be in. When you're inside the prograde marker, you're at the most aerodynamically stable and efficient area, so you get better delta V usage and you're not losing as much to gravity and atmospheric drag. Chances are you won't be able to stay in the prograde marker the entire time, but once you get to about that 25-30 kilometer mark, you should be in a thin enough atmosphere that it won't matter as much. This is more or less for the first two sections of atmosphere. Now, typically what I recommend is keep slowly tilting after you get past that 45 degree mark, and basically once your AP gets to whatever you want your periaps to be. So for example, let's say we wanted to have our periaps at 200 kilometers, we want to get to at least 190, 195, and then we want to be flying as flat as possible, so all the way down to 0. We'll still gain some altitude, but there's a reason for that, which I'll actually touch on a little bit later. But for the first stage, we want to get as much height as we can by still building up horizontal speed, and the reason for that is the AJ-10 and the Aerobee will both work a lot better in vacuum since they're more designed for the vacuum, and we're using our base stage to get us to a point where our second and third stage will be more efficient. So once we get to this point, we want to be basically flying completely flat, and we're going to get ready to hot stage. So once we are at our last second of burn on the LR79, we need to stage so we can ignite the AJ-10 and start the separation process. If you do this too late, you'll lose ullage. If you do it too soon, it can cause flipping and all kinds of weird problems. Sometimes MechJeb can actually save it, but I recommend you practice hot staging as much as you can. It's going to be a pretty common occurrence, especially early on in this game. Now, once we get to the end of the burn, we're going to hot stage and get a separation. We got a good clean separation right there, and then we're going to pretty much just completely fly flat. Now, I'm going to be tipping a little bit on this one because I wanted my periaps to be actually up to 200, and when I originally did the flight plan, I was thinking like 160, but then I remembered I want to be able to clear at least 200, so that's kind of on me. So I'm going to make some quick adjustments, which you can too if you don't quite get your AP to where you want it on your first stage. You could always make slight adjustments on this stage. But by the end of your second stage, whatever your AP is, it needs to be a little bit over what your periaps is going to be. So if you need a periaps of 200, try to get your AP to 205, because the way this is going to work is once you get up to your AP, the top of your orbit, and you ignite the final stage, which is uncontrolled, so we're going to spin it and launch it, the highest your periaps can possibly be is whatever your AP was currently at when you did the final staging. If that doesn't make sense, I'm sorry, I really don't know how else to explain it, but just keep in mind when you're doing these early uncontrolled rockets, whatever your periaps needs to be for the contract, so scientific satellite is 200 kilometers. You need to make sure your AP is up a little over 200 kilometers before you get to your final stage or through your second stage. So when you ignite the final stage, you'll actually be able to achieve a periaps of at least 200. Your AP is going to be kind of high. It'll be a very eccentric orbit unless you do a manual engine cutoff, but that's kind of up to you. Now, once the engine stage is burning, we're going to go ahead and coast. I'm going to use the RCS to lock into prograde, and then I'm going to start using the Q or E key to start spinning spinning the rocket. Now, you need to cut your throttle because it's going to make your RCS try to push you forward. You're going to want to re-engage the throttle before you do your staging because that's going to help give you your ullage, which you will need to ignite the AJ10 stage. So basically just start spinning it, and then you want to be ready to do your staging anywhere between 30 and 10 seconds before you get to the top of your orbit. Typically, if you have a 52 seconds of burn time, 26 seconds is exactly half and half. I personally like to go a little bit longer because it gives you a little bit more of a kick, but honestly, as long as you do it within that last 30 seconds, you should be fine. Now, if for some reason when you re-engage the throttle, it doesn't start making your ullage go up, you can also use the H key to get the same effect. It should kick you forward, and once your propellant is no longer unstable and it's up to like 100%, that is when you want to stage. So as long as you're spinning, you're at the right spot in your orbit, and you have ullage, that is when you stage. And again, I cannot stress this enough, if bringing your throttle up does not start giving you ullage like is happening to me right now, use the H key to get that ullage going because it's not going to work if you don't have ullage. Then once you have everything all set up and ready to go, you're going to go ahead and separate and ignite that stage, and as long as it burns through most of its propellant, you should be in your very first orbits. And that is really all there is to it to getting into orbit for the first time. Again, this is just one of the many ways you can do it. This is what I recommend beginners use because it's a fairly easy rocket. You got way more delta V than you actually need, and it has a pretty decent success rate. Now, the AJ10 does have a bad failure rate early on, so you can use the extra pre-flight, which will make the build time a little bit longer, but overall increase your chances of success. So again, I will be putting this craft file in the description if you just want to download it and check it out, or you can make any kind of variation to this rocket that I'm showing you here. This is just kind of a template. You can make adjustments if you want. You can change some of the stagings if you want. That's totally up to you. Just try to keep it within the stencil and it should be good. Keep in mind the same rocket can also do the solar power launch, the polar, and the scientific satellite. As long as you have the experiments and the solar panels unlocked, this rocket is capable of doing all of that. So you can just reuse this a couple of times to really build up your money, and then once you get the 150-ton launch pad, you can start building bigger and better rockets. But at this point, we have officially hit orbit. We're gonna go ahead and detach the probe core, and we're gonna call this an episode. We still have to tool and buy the parts, obviously. It comes out to being about 215,000 funds, which is a lot, but you'll get all of that back once you do the first satellite, and you can also grab the first scientific contract, and the initial funding can recoup your costs, especially if you already have those items researching. But at that point, we're gonna go ahead and call the episode an end. I want to thank you guys again for stopping by. I hope you learned something, and I hope you guys enjoy. I have been your host, Sonat the Hero Type, and again, this will be the last video I upload to YouTube. It's been a lot of fun and a wild ride, and I want to thank you guys again for all of the support, all of the laughs, and all of the good times. I hope I see you guys when I do decide to stream on occasion. So again, this is me signing off. I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you guys have good success in your own RP1 careers.